haven't gotten into it yet.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to remind folks that we are up, and I mean, at least my server, I'll tell them that we are live, and then I'll
Well,
update.
I'm gonna get a glass of water
Sure
before you
thing,
go.
of course. By all means, I will do the whole promo thing while you are getting your glass of water. Let's see here. So, to anybody just now joining us, Ian ran off to get some water, which is a very smart idea. I encourage everybody else to also get some water. Let me double check one last thing. The timer, I'm not sure if this is actually going to fire, but it's my first time using one of these. Okay, perfect. And then I will have to. Do I have a thing to quote retweet and be like, we're up? Perhaps not. Oh, here it is. Okay. We have 2 minutes before we have to really be on time and get into everything. I have a couple of questions just in case nobody asks anything and we can
Yeah,
prepare this for the VOD, but I didn't know I can move that. I'm sure you have information you'd like to go over yourself, or would you like to promote your channel first? However, would you like to do that? Let me
yeah, no, I
swap
mean, I
this.
don't have anything specifically I want to promote, so I'm just here to talk through questions and go
Sure.
over, yeah, whatever you want, whatever hardballs that you can throw at me.
Hardballs. I even thought of hardballs. I intended this for people who are considering computer science and software development as a potential career.
Yep.
Yeah, I myself, you already know that I pivoted into QA automation, so uh, by all means, if you have like general information you'd like to put out there first or more specific items, I don't really mind if we are very broad or very specific to begin with. We'll go on tangents anyways.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, um, I've done a lot of different talks covering many different angles
Right.
to pivot into the tech industry.
Yeah.
Myself, I've been in the industry for about 15, 20 years, but
Mm-hmm.
I do have more of a traditional background. So I um, I started coding when I was maybe like 10 or 11, I think. I
Oh,
got very
wow.
fortunate that
Mm-hmm.
my parents kind of encouraged me to do that. But I did programming in high school, and then I went to college for computer science.
Mm-hmm.
So in that regards, I'd say I have a very traditional background. Um, but as I've been in the industry, many, if not some of the best engineers that I've worked with have um, come into the industry through very non-traditional means, don't have computer science backgrounds, worked with a lot of folks that have done boot camps,
Mm-hmm.
and I've worked with a lot of folks that have done mid-career pivots. So
Mm-hmm.
at any stage of the career, similarly, a lot of very young folks right out of college that didn't do CS but found it and discovered that they really like it. So despite myself having a very traditional
Mm-hmm.
path into the industry, I definitely have a lot of experience and exposure working with folks that don't have that traditional path. Although I didn't
Mm-hmm.
walk that line.
Could
Um,
you elaborate some more on the differences you notice between people you've worked with who come from like the traditional 4-year CS degree and I don't know, even like a master's in computer science versus someone who comes from a boot camp who either um, had a non-traditional degree, like in humanities or marketing or, any of those things?
Yeah, totally. So I'll answer that in two different
Sure.
kind of cohorts of folks that I've seen. So the first one is the boot camp group
Mm-hmm.
because that is, although they've been around for a while, the more formal boot camps that we're probably familiar with today have been something more in the last like 5 to 8 years that
Okay.
I've seen. Um, and I think the other cohort of folks that I'll talk about are people that independent of a boot camp, just found themselves coding and then found themselves working in the industry. And usually, when I say non-traditional, I mean like the very standard stereotypical trope of like, oh, you studied computer science at an Ivy League school, therefore you should work at Google. Which I don't know if you remember my talk when I spoke with your class. I was like, yeah, I really hate that trope and I hate that that's like expectation.
Um,
But yeah. So I'll talk about both of those groups briefly,
Sure.
but feel free to interrupt because I'll just ramble on
Don't
for
worry, I will be
ages.
responding to chat via text so I don't
Okay,
interrupt the flow of conversation.
cool. Yeah, so with the folks that have come out of boot camps, depending on which boot camp we're talking about, I found that a lot of them have done a really good job at
Hmm.
picking and focusing on a curriculum that really allows people to dive in and start making contributions on the product development side,
Hmm.
on the user facing side, sometimes user interface, a lot of times in web products, which
Hmm.
has some of the fastest iteration um, and the fastest time to like code to customer.
Right.
Like you write code, you make a change to, let's say, a website,
Hmm.
and a customer is looking at that change within like minutes, if not like an hour.
Hmm.
And I think that people that have successfully come out of the boot camps, I have seen them thrive starting off working on those products,
Hmm.
getting exposure to uh, eventually lower and lower levels of the stack if that interests them,
Hmm.
getting exposure to PMs and designers and the whole product development process,
Hmm.
or going into another domain of, let's say, like QA and automation engineering, which is still more closely coupled to the product development side.
Right.
Um, and I, you asked, how do I find the difference between these types of engineers and perhaps like new grads that have come out of a more, again, traditional program? I do feel like they have a lot more because like it's like we're talking about like a 4 or 5 month program where you're just bombarded with very relevant, very recent technology that
Hmm.
they're going to use on day one.
Hmm.
Um, I've worked with a lot of CS grads. Like when you think about Stanford computer science or like Harvard computer science, it sounds like, oh my God, they're going to know everything when they graduate. But again, like I've mentored or I've interviewed
Hmm.
folks that have come out of like a 4 year Harvard CS program, which is great, but they're not necessarily learning the stuff that you're going to be using in an entry level software engineering role.
They're
Um,
learning more the design elements, the algorithms, the data
Yeah,
structures. Okay.
yeah, and it's not like that's bad.
Right.
It's just a different set of fundamentals that they
Hmm.
might be learning. And I've even seen a lot of universities started to modernize their curriculum
Hmm.
to include some of the more modern stuff. However, there's a lot of controversy and debates around that as well. But absent things like internships, I have found like the bootcamp grads actually know the tools and the tech that realistically an entry level software engineer is going to be using, even if they don't have the, oh, like you don't know this crazy esoteric algorithm. It's like, well, no, like, but it's probably not necessary. And like, I could go on for hours about how like 80 to 90% of the stuff I studied in college, like I've never used professionally. But that's not to say I learned the wrong stuff. It's just that's what the curriculum was designed for.
Now, can I
Um,
jump on that because you
yeah,
mentioned precisely that you've noticed a lot of these folks who come out of boot camps, they have the most like cutting edge technology because the curriculum is built to get them, going, hit the ground running on day one.
yeah,
Now, how do you convey that to a recruiter who is saying, "Oh, you don't have the degree. What is your experience? What is your portfolio? What is all of that?" Which, to me, I think that's fine if you don't have, say, ADHD, which impedes your ability to build out a portfolio.
yeah. So your question is like, how do you convey that you, despite not having a traditional background
Yes.
or a degree, you still have marketable and relevant skills?
Hmm.
Is that the question?
Essentially.
Yeah, to a recruiter, hopefully that recruiter is working with the team at a company that has a very clear idea of what they're looking for.
Hmm.
And if that recruiter has a clear set of things that they need to find in an individual, um, it shouldn't matter that you don't have like a CS background and that
Hmm.
foundation. You can often find yourself in situations, and I've talked to a lot of bootcamp grads that have experienced this, where they're talking to a recruiter or a company that doesn't actually know what they want and has a job description that's like, okay, you need to know these 10 languages, you need like a CS degree, and you need like, 10 years of experience,
Now,
and it's a junior level role.
have you seen that one programming meme circling around where the recruiter in the job listing said, you must have 10 years of experience with this one tool, and the guy who created the tool came out and said, this has only been live for like 4 years?
Totally, totally. Yeah. I mean, I think it's like a recurring joke that whenever a new technology comes out, somebody will post a job posting that requires more years of experience than the tool exists, and then occasionally the creator of the tool will chime in to be like, "Well, I guess I'm not fit for the
I'm not
role." Like,
qualified.
yeah, so like the fact that it's like almost memed at this point kind of speaks to how there's this huge disconnect of like the avenues in which you're applying for a job and the
Mm-hmm.
reality of like what the job is actually going to ask you for.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that's not to say you will have those negative experiences. You will talk to companies, you will bomb interviews
Right.
because like they just genuinely didn't know what they wanted.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you are in a situation where you're convincing a recruiter that you have what you need, what they need, you're going to have more success when it's a role that you feel like is well defined. It is an entry level role. The experience is maybe it feels like it's out of reach, but at least it's something achievable for somebody with your experience. Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I don't have 6 months of industry experience, but I'm going to get there versus like, okay, you need 10 years of like this random programming language, which, maybe maybe they need to do a better job of like being realistic about what they want. Um,
Yeah.
but it can be tough.
Yeah. I have a friend who was formerly in the industry and had to come out of it and is now doing like doctorate level work without actually earning a degree because it's all cutting edge medical stuff that is like NDA, NDA, NDA. But they gave me this advice saying that when you go into an entry level position or any position in tech, that you should realistically expect to be onboarding for about a year before you understand the code base. Do you find that to be true? Do you expect someone to ramp up faster than that? What is realistic and what is something that management is pushing for that's going to make you burn out?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. Because I've certainly over the last several years hired engineers at all ranges of the
Mm-hmm.
experience spectrum. And I've also worked with teams and other managers who have varying degrees of expectations on how fast somebody will ramp up.
Mm-hmm.
So I can talk about it from my experience, but everybody's expectations, unfortunately, will be a bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that well, the first shocking fact that I think a lot of people don't realize is the average tenure of a software engineer in the Bay Area
Mm-hmm.
is about 1.7 years.
Okay.
So, just over a year and a half is how long the average software engineer stays at a company, which is crazy. It's not a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I've spent over 5 years at the last two jobs that I've worked at. So, like, I'm perhaps a statistical anomaly in that regards. But it is a reality that frames your question from a statistics perspective, in that if most engineers are only spending a year and a half at companies, a 1 year ramp up, companies recognize is going to be potentially too long. Now, of course, like, these are all averages and numbers, but
Mm-hmm.
it, in my opinion, is a really enlightening and kind of both scary, but it basically sets this like, you know, the company is hoping that they can get really great work out of you for a year and a half, but after that, they're realistically thinking, well, you might move on and go somewhere else, and that's very well your right to do so.
Mm-hmm.
So to your question of like, well, how quickly should you be onboarding? This will depend on the skill level. So somebody that's been in the industry for 10 years, I expect them to onboard much sooner than
Of
somebody that's
course.
a new grad. And when I say much sooner, I would expect them to be getting on their feet and having a good idea of this is like a more senior engineer. Within a month, I would be checking in with them to see how well they've oriented themselves around their new team and their environment. And I would say within a month from then, I would be expecting to see some material contributions that they've made.
So like
Yeah,
deliverables.
yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're talking about like 2+ months in and they're still just completely lost and they have no idea what's going on, or they haven't driven or shown a path to driving impact, then I would start getting a little bit concerned. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not always the individual. Sometimes it's just not the right fit for the role of the person. But
Mm-hmm.
that's like a time horizon that I'm setting. Okay.
Now, I have a Zoogler in the chat who just wanted everybody to know that at Google,
Yeah.
a lot of their tools and services are proprietary, which
Yes.
made the ramp up much harder. So
Yep.
again, it depends on the company.
Totally. Google is a great example of a company, as your chat mentioned, that everything is proprietary. Everything, well, not everything, but a lot of things are custom,
Hmm.
which is uh, it can be a blessing and a curse as well for long tenured Google employees.
Hmm.
Um, but I've never worked at Google, so I can't speak too much about the onboarding there. But absolutely, there's going to be that ramp up challenge with new tech. Having said that, independent of Google having pretty unique internal tools and stack,
Hmm.
every job that you're going to be starting off, it's inevitable that you're probably going to be learning something new.
Hmm.
You're going to be exposed to a new technology, and it's very rare that I hire somebody that has the exact experience with the exact skills and tools that I need.
I see.
Again, Google is kind of a special example because everything is going to be unique.
Hmm.
But Google's also one of the biggest tech companies and employers of software engineers, and they have hundreds of people dedicated to helping people onboard.
Okay.
Um,
That makes sense. So they have the resources.
they have the resources. Facebook's another example of a
Hmm.
company that has a really, at least from what the industry talks about, and I've shared with my peers, like they have a very good onboarding program.
Hmm.
I actually think this is a when you talk about, well, how long do you expect onboard? And I know you're still going to re-ask me, well, okay, so if I'm a boot camp new grad, how long should I be onboarding? I will get to that question, but it's like a lot easier said than just like, oh, 3.5 months, and then that's the number. For people that are thinking about entering the industry, when you're deciding what kind of company you're going to go work for, that will actually have a material impact on how well or what kind of onboarding experience you're going to get. And I'll take two extremes. Um, Joining a early stage startup, Series A or B startup, crazy Silicon Valley startup, and then on the other end of the spectrum is the joining a large company.
I was the
Let's
SV startup, Series
yeah,
A.
right. Yeah. Let's use Google as the other
Okay.
extreme. Okay. Neither is better or worse. They're just different.
Hmm.
And they are different and tailored to different types of people and how they thrive.
Okay.
I know a lot of people that thrive in a more structured environment where they have, I wouldn't use the word guardrails because I feel like that's kind of like a derogatory term, or it's like pejorative in this sense, but like there is a structured environment that allows them to learn to develop their skills and get feedback in a way that's, again, more structured. And that's how they learn. Great. There's other people that like getting pushed into the deep end and them fending for themselves and figuring out how to swim. If you put the person in the wrong environment, so if we put that person at Google and then you put the Google style person in the new startup, I think it's going to be disastrous outcome for both individuals if they know themselves well enough to know what kind of environment they're going to do well in.
Hmm.
If you're lucky enough to know what kind of environment you will thrive in, then that can and should influence what kind of company you apply for. Even if it's like, oh, I've got this great job opportunity at this early stage startup, but I know I will struggle in an environment where I don't have very much support, where I'm on my own and I get no feedback. A job is a
Ooh.
job, but you're really, you need to know what you're getting yourself into.
Hmm.
Um, I was a very early employee at Branch, the company that I spent the last 5.5 years at. And when I joined, there was about 20, 25 people. There was no onboarding program. On my
Hmm.
first day of work, and again, I was joining in a management role, so it's a little bit different. But first day of work, I showed up, and I think they forgot I was They forgot I was joining. Gave me a laptop, pointed at a chair, and said, "We're really busy right now. I hope you figure it out. Here's your
Oh my
pass."
goodness.
And I've worked at startups before, so that's what I was expecting,
Hmm.
and it was not a surprise to me. I had to talk to people. I had to ask questions. I had to, and I give this advice to new grads as well as senior engineers. Like when you join a new company, it's almost like you have a limited amount of resources. That is how much time people are going to afford to you before they feel like you're getting on under their skin.
I think we need to
Um,
pause for a moment though, because we are scaring off one of the chat members who's like, I'm a total beginner when it comes to coding and computer science. How do
yeah,
I get into the field? And I
yeah.
think we can both answer that a little bit. Do you want to go first or should I?
So wait, could you repeat the
Yes,
question?
yes,
Just
yes.
one.
So
Yeah,
the full question is, what is the best route for someone to take to get into the computer science field? Is college 100% necessary? Are there any great online tools that can help in this regard? Because they're, again, complete beginner.
sure. I'd love to hear your take first because
Okay,
I've
sure.
been blabbing for a while.
So, John Bonsai, I have no computer science experience in college. I did a game design course and I was masochistic about that. They said I could do Scratch if I wasn't a comp sci major. I tried to code with no experience trying to do like C or something like that. It was a bad experience. I think I got like a D on that assignment. Again, college is not required. You can do what I did, which I did a boot camp after the fact. Or before that, even, you can go to Free Code Camp, you can go on Coursera, you can go on Udemy, you can go on all of those online courses, look at resources, all of that. Hello, AKL Trifectas. Good to see you. Good to see Blade Mastero. Good to see Quantum Brand. Good to see everybody. Shout outs. Woo! Um, but again, coming back to the question of how do I get into computer science without college, you can 100% get into computer science without the degree. And a lot of people will start their computer science careers later than you'd think.
Yeah.
So, your turn.
Um,
Your turn.
no, I love that answer. So I did and studied computer science because I thought I wanted to be a computer scientist, whatever that means. Um, and I'll actually separate the idea of like computer science from like learning how to code
Right.
because I think there's a lot of great resources, structured and unstructured, free and not free, that you can learn how to code. And learning how to code, I think, is such an important and incredible skill, but it doesn't mean that you have to like be like, whenever I think of a computer scientist, and this is like awful, I think of like somebody in a lab coat or, somebody in like one of those textbooks wearing like one of, it's like a
Someone who's like
professor with like a
designing
jean
new
jacket.
algorithms and structures to be more
Yeah, yeah.
super
I,
efficient.
I thought I needed to do that. Now, don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think that if you're going to say, "Well, I want to be a computer scientist," I still like at my stage of my career, I usually kind of equate that to pursuing academia, pursuing like a more academic, more formal path in doing research, for instance. And I
Hmm.
think that that's super interesting. And I know a lot of folks that have done that.
Hmm.
But that's actually, for me, it's very different than like, I want to learn how to code. I want to work for a tech company. I want to get into the industry. And I think the path to that, a lot of options. And um, if the question is, how do I learn how to code so that I could someday be on a path to work at a tech company in a technical role? Um, I think the where do you start? The real question is like, how can I start learning how to code? It's a very overwhelming amount of information online, but all of the resources that you described, I think, were great.
I love Code Academy. I think that's the easiest one to start with, to just learn the syntax, learn the terms, because you have the live example there as you're coding.
Yeah. Um, yeah, those weren't around when I was learning how to code. I wish they were.
Hmm.
But um, once you decide that you want to learn how to code, it will be immediately, again, overwhelming on how many different things you can learn and what you could learn. So,
Hmm.
picking a small project, picking something that will incrementally give you validation that you're making progress,
Hmm.
I think is important. Like that could be make a website. That is a very canonical example of like put a box and some text and an image on the screen. If you write 10 lines of HTML and you've never written a line of code before, you just wrote 10 lines of code and you've taken one step towards that direction.
So,
And then you go from
yeah.
there.
From that, also, I think it's important to remember that a lot of people slam on HTML and CSS as like not real languages, but I think that's
Mm-hmm.
only insofar as they don't have the same functionality as, other languages. But, but I always hear, we don't have enough front end engineers. Nobody wants to do
Yep.
front end. Nobody wants to do front end.
Yeah.
So, just saying, it's not bad to go into that, especially if you're on Neopets like so many of us my age.
Yeah, I use that example very specifically because HTML is code for me, and many people will disagree. But it's like, hey, like, I don't really care too much about what everybody else thinks. It's how I learned how to code. I wrote, I think the first computer code that I wrote was when I was younger. I made a website. It was like the worst HTML code ever written, whatever, and the entire website was, this was like, I guess I'm like aging myself a little bit, but this was like in the early 90s. I used to buy these video game magazines. I think they were called like Game Power or something like that, where they would post reviews and like cheat codes for arcade games.
Hmm.
So I made a website that basically just copy and pasted the cheat codes. If I recall correctly, it was like the fatality moves for Mortal Kombat 1, because that like arcade was like really
Hmm.
popular at the time. And I made a website that just put the codes that I'd read from a magazine onto the internet somehow. And I had help. I had a mentor. I got lucky that somebody helped me do that. And that was HTML. It was like janky, broken HTML. I had animated GIFs. I had like black blinking background. It
Oh my
was a really cool
gosh.
website. And then I learned JavaScript.
Hmm.
And then I learned PHP.
Nice.
Um, and then I learned Flash, which is, as of this year, no longer a real technology. That was finally phased out. But
Hmm.
I was actually a Flash programmer for the first several years of my career. And I was actually a game programmer using the Flash
Newgrounds?
platform.
Were you on
I was
Newgrounds?
on Newgrounds, and some of my games are still there. Um,
Hey.
but yeah, Newgrounds is where I learned a lot of my coding, because Newgrounds had forums, and the forums were people who weren't in CS, and they were just coding because they needed to, like,
Hobbyists.
hey, how do I put this pixel on the screen?
Hmm.
Great. Now I know how to do that. How do I make it move from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen? Great. And like, this was just me tinkering in my parents' basement, slowly learning this stuff. Um, and I'll admit, like then and still today, I always struggled with this idea of like, oh, this isn't real code. Like my HTML website, this isn't real. And I felt bad about this. And then I started doing Flash, and I was like, well, this isn't real code, but I'm still having fun with it. And I still struggle with that a little bit, where I'm like, oh, well, I'm not doing like real engineering, real computer science. But it's just like, well, I mean, 20 years into my career, if I'm still worrying about this, I don't think it's going to matter too much. But I share that with you just because like everybody has that, some levels of insecurity about, oh, like, is this real code? And it all started with like a really crappy website
Yeah, I
with just text.
remember, like way back in like university for me, it was a lot of looking at Tumblr themes with the CSS, the cascading style sheets. That's code. It
Mhm.
and some of it even has functionality depending on the like animations, the web kits that you're using for it, which I mean, it's not the same as a function, but still, it's animating elements. That's part of thinking about design, thinking about
Yep.
UI and UX.
Yep.
And I think there were like a couple questions I might have missed because we were just going and going.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Uh, so Spencer saying, I spent years in high school and college learning C++ plus plus and
Ooh.
not working on real projects because
Yeah.
C++ plus plus was the only language used in games.
Oh man. Yeah.
There's a
Um.
couple of people from Irvine's CDG,
Yep.
uh, not CDG, sorry, Video Game Development Club, because Blizzard's in Irvine, so there's a
Yep.
thing at my school. I think there are a lot of aspiring game developers who are here. And
Yep.
could you speak to the difference between programming in games versus programming for web or software development?
Yeah. Sure. Um. Let's see. So again, my background professionally
Hmm.
is I work in tech. I live in San Francisco. I've been working for like internet tech companies for my whole career.
Hmm.
So a lot of my experiences started as a front end, then moved to the back end,
Hmm.
doing a lot more infrastructure and that type of engineering.
Okay.
And I know it is different than the game programming world, but I think there's a lot of transferable skills. I mentioned to you earlier that I started learning how to code by making Flash games.
Exactly. That's why I wanted to
Yeah.
bridge the two.
And my goal was to become a programmer in the gaming industry. Like my dream I remember vividly was to work on like, these huge blockbuster games. That was all of the rage when I was in high school and college. It was when I was in my undergrad, was when there was a very famous situation with EA.
Ooh.
For those of you that may have either work at EA or have been following the industry, where I can't remember what it's called now, but there's a Wikipedia article for it. But it was basically the angry spouse email, or the angry spouse letter, and it was a situation where the spouse of one of their lead programmers wrote this open letter talking about how bad the culture was and how bad the industry was, and it really kind of blew the lid on how um, toxic the industry had gotten. So at this
Mm,
point, this would have been in like the early 2000s.
I see.
And EA was one of the biggest game publishers at the time.
I
And I
tried to interview with EA actually, but I couldn't get
Yeah,
past the phone screen.
yeah. I mean, I didn't even get a phone screen. So like you got further than I did.
I mean, that's because they were at demo night, though.
Yeah. Um, but I learned C++. I learned I want to say C sharp,
Hmm.
because it was also around the time when Xbox and Microsoft released the XNA platform, where they started building open tools where you could develop Xbox games and you could develop tools for their gaming platform.
Tangentially
Um,
related, the Kinect is
yeah.
now being used in medical devices and prototyping.
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
That's kind of like what my friend's working on, that whole like doctorate without the degree tech.
Right.
Yeah. But anyways,
Yeah.
go on.
Um, but yeah, I mean, I guess I could say I got turned off a little bit by that
Yeah,
whole situation.
not surprising.
And I also got, I never got an interview with EA. So
So I guess that's the sign. Move on.
yeah, but being exposed to so much technology, I just continued to gravitate towards projects and things that I found interesting.
Hmm.
Actually, I vividly remember the way that I went from um, basically casually casually interested in game programming and wanting to go there, to where I ended up on web. I was trying to write a video game where it was a flash game for Newgrounds or something, one of those platforms,
Right.
and I wanted to build a scoreboard so that people it would post the top scores,
Hmm.
and everything I had written up to that point was moving pixels around the screen, and then it was all in the browser, it was all in
Hmm.
the client, and I couldn't wrap my head around of like, how does a player submit their score and send it so you can see who are the top 10 players? Like, it just blew my mind, and I spent hours and hours reading about every single thing I could about like how do you do that, like what is a database, like what's a backend, like I had no idea what this stuff was. And everybody that I met that knew anything about programming, I'd ask them, and like over time, I learned how to get better at asking questions.
Hmm.
But then I would go up to like, oh, you know how to code, like C, that's like real programming. How do I store the high score for my video game on a server? And they'd be like, what the hell are you talking about? But eventually, I figured it out and I learned how to do that, and I learned how to write a file to a server, and AWS didn't exist at this time, so I had to like set up a server and get all of this stuff
Oh my
working. But
goodness.
um, by the time I figured all of this stuff out, I was less interested in writing a video game. And I was more interested in like, oh, this back end server technology is really cool.
Hmm.
Like, I want to work more on web products. I want to work more on, these types of things. And that kind of like really pushed my career in that direction. And I still have a lot of respect, and I really see the indie games that are being released
Hmm.
and some of the big blockbuster games that are coming out are insane.
I know,
Like
right?
they're great, but it was just it's how I got there. So um, yeah, I don't know if that just was a long, rambly kind of story to the.
I think those are the most helpful experiences though, when someone can speak to the entirety of like that narrative, getting from point A to point B. It's
Mhm.
more useful, in my opinion at least, than here is an article about how to do X, Y, and Z, because it's
Yeah,
so dry and dense and it doesn't really come
yeah,
across well.
yeah,
Now, I had a question for you about. Okay, I want your thoughts on the weird prestige difference between back end programming and front
Yeah.
end programming.
Yes.
Because
Yes.
personally, I forced myself to focus on the back end, thinking, oh, they're not going to take me seriously unless I know how to hook up the server to the back end and then
Yep.
pipe things forward. But then I hear from other people, oh, we need more front end engineers because nobody wants
Yep.
to do it. I would love to do that stuff. I love the UX UI side of
Yeah.
things.
Yeah. I have a lot, like I could talk for hours about this topic.
We should probably
And
slow down a little bit, though, and explain the terminology for our friend John, who is super new to everything, though.
sure. Yeah. So, I mean, if I hear the question correctly, or at least like the topic, it's about this age-old front end versus back end developer
Yeah.
conversation. And it's framed in this idea that there's a stack. And when you're building anything, you have this stack of tech. And at the top of the stack is your front end, which is the user interface, or it's what the user ends up seeing. On a website, it's the web tech. In a game, it's like the graphics and like the interface. Maybe in like a more another example would be like in cars, there's tons of software, like the UI of people touching the buttons and
Hmm.
adjusting like the AC. And then lower in the stack is oh man, it's like the AI, it's like the back end, it's like the servers and databases. And the debate is, well, which one is more prestigious? Which one is harder? And I hate conflating, well, what's harder? And that means it's better to do.
It's the whole
And
like surgeon versus general practitioner
totally,
argument.
yeah, which I find really funny. And I have experience on both sides in that I was a very insecure front end engineer for many, many years. Insecure in the sense that like I never felt like my code was good enough. And even when it was good enough, I wasn't a backend engineer. So it doesn't even matter anyways. Like
Oh.
I'm not a real engineer. And then I have the experience of being on the other side of the fence where different organizations and where my career took me, I was decidedly on the back end. And I was constantly uh, working with engineers on the back end that were struggling with the idea that my code, no matter how good it is, the customers will never understand it, and they won't ever appreciate the stuff that I did. And a lot of the articles that come out about our changes, or a lot of the news and fanfare, is around the most customer facing things. Um, so like on the other side of the fence, there was like the grass is greener, and that they're like, oh, I wish I was on the front end because I was like, I'd be able to engage and work with customers. So I've done my best to kind of step away from that debate and be like, it doesn't really matter.
Right.
Um, if you're able to find kind of excitement and challenges, then you should just do that and not
Mm.
worry about what the other person on the other side of the stack is saying. Um,
Right. And I think it's also kind of silly to try and divide the two out when they're so interdependent upon one another, where if the front end's no good and that data being collected from the user isn't hitting the back end or the server, then all of that business logic in the back is pointless anyways.
yep. Yeah, I actually made this in this like I had this exact conversation with a colleague, I want to say 10 years ago. I'm sitting so actually, yeah, I'll tell a story which is very relevant to this conversation. So 10 years ago, well, actually, it's like 11 or 12 years ago around now, but I was a software engineer in Toronto. That's where I'm from.
Hmm.
And I wanted to work for a cool tech company in Silicon Valley. And I got very lucky. I interviewed and I got a job at this microblogging platform at the time, right?
Hmm.
So all this website did was let you type in 140 characters and then post it, and then it would get blasted to the people on the internet. And like all my friends thought I was like insane for joining this. Like, what the hell is microblogging, anyways, right? So this, of course, was like Twitter. This was Twitter in the earlier days, before they even had a mobile app.
Oh, wow.
And I remember, so I joined the team. I was a front end engineer for Twitter. I was working on twitter.com, which I thought was like one of the most exciting and up and coming web properties. And I also knew, though, that there was a shift towards mobile, and I felt like it might be one of the last big .com companies. And
Hmm.
that may be true. And that, like, when you think about, let's say, in consumer, you think about something like TikTok or Twitch, or even things like Discord and Slack. Like, you don't go to their website. Like I'm sure there's folks dialed in and watching on twitch.tv right now, but no one really thinks about like, oh, what's the website? They think about the company, the app, and all of the other things that they do. But anyway, I was a front end engineer at Twitter, and I remember sitting there one day late at night in the office, and I was sitting across from one of the back end teams. I was a front end, they were a back end, and they were talking about these algorithms that I'd never heard of. They were talking about, some of them were early Google employees. Some of them had worked at Facebook, and I was just like, oh my God, these people are so much smarter than me, and they're working on the most complicated, sophisticated things. And like, they just diagrammed and drew in this whiteboard, this thing that I will never comprehend. I'm just like this lowly front end engineer. And what happened, and I swear this wasn't me or any of my friends trying to sabotage something, but we were working on completely separate to the crazy algorithms that they were kind of talking about. We were working on some redesign.
Mm-hmm.
We had to revamp the way that Twitter.com looked,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a single missing semicolon in one of the JavaScript files. It was probably a million lines of JavaScript. And at the time, the tooling and the linters and all of the build tools, they were not what they are today. So we compressed and minified the file and we shipped it live. And one missing semicolon took down the entire website, right? And twitter.com was down, and like we showed a fail whale. And it was really funny to me that all of the algorithms, all of the back end, all of the diagrams aside, both teams needed to work together, because if their stuff didn't work, um, the back end would break, and our stuff would fall over. But unfortunately, in this particular instance, the front end wasn't working, and there was literally one missing semicolon that ended up taking down this entire website for like 10 minutes. So it's like we're all in this together, and it's unfortunately it was like literally a single semicolon that was missing. And then we built tools to prevent that from ever happening again. And
Wait,
it'd
but
be very easy for, sorry, you're gonna ask.
no, I was just gonna ask how many hours you spent staring at the lines of code trying to find that one semicolon after it had been minified.
I think we rolled it back, and then
Okay,
somebody
okay, you rolled it
somebody
back.
figured out
Thank
what happened.
goodness.
But a very, hearing the story, I think a very cynical engineer might, like a cynical backend engineer might be like, well, yeah, that just proves how easy and how ridiculous front end engineering is, because like certainly I could have done a better job. I wouldn't have missed that semicolon and the website would have broke. But it's like a really great engineer on the back end might see that problem and be like, man, that's unfortunate. That's like a really unfortunate situation that happened. Can I help figure out how we can prevent this from happening again? I have no idea how this stuff works. I'm sure you guys did everything you could have to prevent that from happening.
There it is, there it is. The blameless post-mortem. Who's gonna point fingers and who is focused on fixing the problem?
Yeah, yeah. I think if you're very lucky, you'll work with engineers that are the latter, are the ones that say, um, I have to assume and trust that you and your team did everything you could to not break the website. Do you need help? Can I help do anything? And I'll admit I don't know the front end. I don't know how this stuff works, but I want to learn.
Mhm.
And forgive me if I ask dumb questions. Like these are the type of engineers that you want to work with. And it's very you're very lucky if you can surround yourself with engineers like that, because you're going to learn from them. And it's very distracting, and honestly, unfortunately, very common for engineers to take the opposite approach, where they're like, oh my God, you're so dumb, like how did you do that, that was such a bad issue, because every engineer is going to be insecure in their own way, and those insecurities can bubble up in really toxic ways sometimes.
Ooh,
um,
we have an interesting question from chat. Did the person who missed the semicolon get fired? I'm inclined to say no, because where's the proof that someone was responsible for missing that?
yeah, so there is proof,
Uh-oh.
because every line of code gets checked in, every line of code has a commit message. um, but that's more for historical administrative
Right,
reasons,
of
not
course.
for pointing a finger. To Twitter, so I spent a great part of my career at that company. Had a very good culture of there was no fear of being fired for missing semicolon. The person who made the mistake or had this situation come up took ownership of it, and called for help. And the release team rolled back, and we sat down and figured out how it happened. In this particular instance, I think it was completely out of their control.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was just a confluence of events that happened and caused us to happen. And no, the person was not fired. But yeah, it sucks that somebody might think, hey, like you made one mistake and you're out of here. And unfortunately, there probably are companies that may have taken that action.
Right.
Um, and thankfully, in this particular case, the person learned from it and they moved on. Yeah. And that person was me. And I did not. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I'm curious if this is more just kind of for
Mm-hmm.
those coming in, if you feel so inclined to disclose your resume or your experience. I was not going to put that out there myself live in case you were
Sure.
like, it's not that big of a deal.
Like my actual resume itself.
Or like your title and your experience and like how incredible you are.
Oh, gosh. So I'm currently director of engineering. So I'm an engineering manager overseeing, large teams. Um, I've been an eng manager for about 7 years. And we can talk about what engineering management really is versus just programming and being an engineer on a team.
Hmm.
Before that, I was a software engineer,
Hmm.
and I spent about I want to say 6 or 7 years as a what we call in the individual contributor,
I see.
which is not supposed to be it sounds weird, it's so mechanical, but it really refers to like you don't have people report to you, you're not a manager, but
Hmm.
in and it's perfectly fine to be an individual contributor, or an IC is the acronym, your whole career, have a very successful career in that. I did that for about 6 or 7 years. um, at startups, at mid-sized companies. And before that, I actually spent some time as a product manager
Okay.
briefly. I spent some time doing UX
Hmm.
briefly, when I didn't really know what I wanted to do and I was just trying to figure it all out.
Right.
Yeah. But yeah, currently in that kind of management engineering leadership role. And yeah, I've been in the Bay Area working in Silicon Valley for about 11 years.
Hmm.
And I was working in the industry for about 5 or 6 years before that.
Okay.
Yeah. That's my resume.
That's your resume. Woo!
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's humbling, I think, to hear all of this from someone who's quote unquote so high up on the chain of command, so to speak. Um, just in the sense that, there's all these horror stories about really bad management styles and
Yeah.
how people can be really reactive. And
Yeah.
again, the idea that people assign blame. Um, I'm trying to follow up with a question.
Sure.
How do you feel about the quote unquote tech bro mentality? Because you mentioned there are engineers who do get really arrogant and point fingers and try to
Yep.
like undermine their own peers because it's so competitive.
Yeah. I think like um,
The
the tech
stereotype,
bro
if you will.
stereotype, it's evolved over time. It's
Okay.
gotten, it's, it's, uh, split off into different types of problematic types of engineers as well,
Oh boy.
versus just one, singular tech bro dude or problem. Um, as an example, for instance, and this is just one of the nuances of like that tech bro uh, problem in the industry. One of the ways that you could split it is the very confrontational, very aggressive, and very alpha type attitude, which perhaps you might stereotypically see on like Wall Street in like the 80s or something. When you think about like a really aggro banker, like the Wolf of Wall Street, it's like a perfect example of like
Hmm.
that was encouraged. Like that was like industry wide, and people were actually like, beating their chest and being like, this is what a good employee looks like. So I think that there's elements of the tech bro toxic culture that embody that. And I think
Hmm.
that shining a light on that has helped a little bit because you have more companies, more managers, and more teams that are like, that's not how you grow a team. That's not how you put down your team member if they screw up. That's not how you help.
Right.
An example of this being when I'm working with engineers and they're trying to get promotions. Let's say you're a senior engineer and you want to get to the next level. Some of the things I look for, it's not how complicated your code is. It's not what was the hardest problem you solved. It's show me two or three junior engineers that you helped level up. And if you can't demonstrate your ability to help your peers, how can I build a team around you? I can't, because you can't just shout your way into a great product. Well, some people can, but like that's not a company I want to work at.
Hmm.
Maybe that wasn't the case 10, 15 years ago. And that's part of the evolution away from, um, this attitude of the best engineer is the loudest and most angry engineer.
Hmm.
Again, that idea that if you're at a good company that has a good team and environment, the senior engineers are spending more of their time helping their peers than necessarily sitting in the corner with the lights off, like coding something really, really complicated. And I actually really generally hate that idea. And I had this idea for years that like a good engineer is one that writes really hard to understand code, solves the hardest problems,
Oh, geez.
and is writing these algorithms that no one else can understand because it sounded cool. But like now, as a manager, if I had an engineer that wrote code that no one could understand, that would be awful because it's like
Right, because how can anyone maintain it?
how can anyone maintain it? How can anyone help? They're only as good as their ability to stay up all night
Hmm.
writing code, which sucks.
Yeah.
Like a common example of this that I like that people always use is, people talk about 10x engineers, and like, every company has a 10x engineer. These are the engineers that can write 10 times the amount of code as their peers, which is just absurd and ridiculous. But it perpetuates this idea of like these wonder engineers. But the reality is like, if you really want to make yourself a 10x engineer, or you really want to be kind of fostering the culture of real 10x engineers, find one engineer that can make 10 other engineers twice as productive. And suddenly that one person is a 10x engineer and they didn't write a single line of code. And that's the engineer that I'm going to give a promotion to. And I'm going to
Hmm.
say, this is the person that I want leading my team. Um, so this was a long, I kind of caveat from your technical question, but the other facet of that, and there's unfortunately multiple ways of slicing that evil toxic pie. Um, the other one is like there was and still is a lot of like misogyny in the industry. There was a
Yeah.
lot of like male dominated teams, engineer, and even as of like every day, I'm sure you can read something about somebody just saying something so idiotic or making a comment that's just so pushing the industry back, which sucks, especially when it's coming from companies that you want to be leading the charge. um, we are by no means out of the woods here. I think that it's still a big problem, not unique to Silicon Valley, but it's problematic here.
I don't think it's even
um,
unique to the tech industry. It's just that, because of the money in the tech industry, there's
yeah,
that kind of authority and power to say, we can get away with this.
yeah, and it's that's a really complicated and challenging problem that the industry needs to continue investing and working on.
Hmm.
But going back to your idea of like, well, what's a tech bro, and what does that culture look like? I've definitely seen and been exposed to that kind of culture too, where you could define a tech bro as like a dude that programs and is like a misogynist. It's like, yeah, I would call that person a tech bro, and I don't want to work with that person. Um, yeah, unfortunately, the tech bro is a very multi-faced beast that I think it's important to talk about though, because people need to understand what is not acceptable so that you can focus on the things that are.
Right.
Um,
And I want to say that my one venture into the professional sphere of Silicon Valley, I was the most junior hire, but I was also the first female hire.
mm,
And so not only was there a lack of support in that role, because our
mhm,
most senior person on the team left for a sabbatical pretty much 2 weeks after I began. And so I had to figure it out with like a new guy, and we were the QA team. That was it. It was just the two of us, two new people, and one of them's an intern, right? I also felt a lot of microaggressions in that space, but
yep,
I didn't really know how to navigate talking about that. And I tried to
yep,
be very gentle-handed about it, saying, "Could we have like a diversity course in it?" And the
yep.
response was, "We don't have the number of employees to warrant holding a diversity
Yikes,
class."
yikes, yeah,
So I took that from upper management to mean you're just rocking the boat. Why are you doing this?
Yeah. Well, that's unfortunate to hear that you had that experience. Um, and I think hopefully what we're seeing is a lot of companies that perhaps like the experience you had that are slowly but surely, and certainly not as fast as they need to be, kind of
Mm-hmm.
learning and trying to change. I'd hope that at least one person at the company or people that you interacted with in the next iteration in the next company or role might stop and be like, hey, you know what? Like I saw this in my last company and it wasn't great. We're going to do it a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen that in companies I've worked in that people are bringing change to their new companies and roles. Hopefully, people in leadership roles that can be the voice for folks that don't have that platform. Um, but yeah, it's unfortunate that you saw and got exposed to that. And I'd like to believe that that's not the average situation, but again, like that's not an experience that
I
I'm
mean,
certainly not in your position, so I can't speak on your behalf.
I don't know how much of it was just the matter of its startup culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's that kind of desire to make it very horizontal, but at the same time, that means boundaries might not be established the same way in a more structured and professional environment.
Yep.
It's all like all hands on deck, but also take a shot with everyone, happy hour after the fact, got to
Yep.
bond, bro it up a bit. That
Yeah.
was hard for me.
Yeah. I would hope that like the idea of startup culture doesn't have to include this kind of
Hyper
toxic,
masculinity.
yeah, environment where not everybody feels like they're thriving. Um, because I think there could be I think there could be a definition of, well, what is real startup culture
Hmm.
that has a lot of great characteristics that are um,
Right.
objectively good environments to foster innovation. Um, although I think right now, if you ask somebody, well, what is startup culture? They're going to include a lot of things that are like very eyebrow raising or like questionable or like not even questionable. That is the vector of change that I hope that we're on the path towards.
Right.
But it's going to take a lot of work.
Hmm. I
Yeah,
just want to do a time check. We are at about an hour in, and I do kind of want to focus back into the different tracks in software development that one can take. Like we mentioned, there's QA, there's QA automation, there's front end, back end, there's the full stack,
yeah.
there's networking, there's all kinds of things. Would you like to just, do a one-on-one on that?
Sure. Yeah. And this is I think that you were there for this. I did a talk.
Yeah.
I dedicated an hour to talking about different types of engineers.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I basically unpacked this idea of we use and throw around the term software engineer very generally now because
Hmm.
it's such a broad um, it's such a broad uh, topic. There's so many different levels of specialization, and
Right.
even then, specialization is not a requisite. Um, going back to how we started this call talking about learning how to code, right? Differentiating that from being a CS person. I think learning how to code is the path to being a professional software engineer or whatever title you want to move to attain. Um, and it starts with learning how to code. It starts with getting a job, coding, and doing stuff. You're just writing code. You're not a specific type of engineer. You're just a person at a company getting paid to punch keys and
Right.
then you make stuff happen, which is awesome and great. And like that's how I started my career. But yeah, like front end and back end is the common way of slicing the pie, but that's like
Hmm.
a still a sweeping broad
Right,
generalization.
exactly.
Because within front end, there's like 20 different types of front end
Oh
engineers,
my God,
probably.
there is.
Yeah. Or at least I've worked with 20 different types of front ends that wouldn't necessarily call themselves the same as the 19th front end standing beside them. But let's enumerate a couple of them.
Sure.
So, there's the front end engineers, which I could break down into talk about um, UI engineers, web developers, people focusing on web. Um, there is folks that are working on like more the full stack, and I use the air quotes, that might be more interested in some of the back end stuff, but
Hmm.
still working in the front end, working in the product, application engineering. And I'm talking about my experience, which is in like the web, um, you know, tech tech company
Mm-hmm.
blanket,
Right.
software engineering. There's tons of mobile development still happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
iOS and Android development are the biggest platforms, and I wouldn't call an Android or an iOS developer a front end, even though they are interacting with and doing stuff that the user touches. So like again, if it's like I learned how to code and I attained some basic skills, but I'm obsessed with like my iPhone and I would love to learn how to put a pixel on the screen there.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's a rabbit hole that you can dive right into. And every company has an iPhone app and needs iPhone developers. And Apple created a great platform instead of Google where you can basically pay $50 for a license and then ship an app onto the Apple Store
Mm-hmm.
or the Google Play Store for free in that case. Um, so mobile developers is what I was kind of getting to there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there is there's like data science,
Ooh, data
um,
science.
yeah, which is an entire booming and bustling domain of, and it's still to be determined, like to be defined. I'm sure you could talk to 50 different data scientists, and they would all give you a different description of what they do.
Is that within the realm of machine learning and AI? Or is
It
that
could be,
separate?
but it
Okay.
doesn't necessarily have to be
So there's some
AI.
overlap necessarily.
Yeah, my take is like AI, machine learning, and all of that jazz is like a new set of terminology that's getting and gaining a lot of buzz. But to unpack it, there's just so much behind that there.
Mm-hmm.
Data scientists are working with data, believe it or not. They're helping make decisions. They're trying to make sense of huge amounts of data. They're querying data. They're accessing the data. They're writing reports on the data and doing analysis on it in many different
Mm-hmm.
ways. They might be programming. A lot of data scientists that I know didn't come from a CS background.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they come from like a stats or a math background, or maybe
Right.
not at all.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there is a huge I actually mentioned this to you, I think that when we first met, there's the idea of support engineering, solutions
Yes,
engineering,
you did. I remember that now.
and sales engineering, which
Mm-hmm.
is another completely different facet of engineering roles. And I'll go into a story which is relevant to this, but where you are um, working with customers, working with complicated technical products, and you're basically doing integration. Like you're
Mm-hmm.
helping them debug, them being customers, debug what they're trying to do, what they're trying to build, because you
Mm-hmm.
become an expert in your company's product.
And I think it's worth mentioning to chat, for example, that the end user isn't your only client, or rather, the end user isn't just your average Joe. You also have developers who are your
Yes,
end user, which is what you're referring to with support engineering. You're going to
totally.
have third-party developers come on, use your product to hook up to their applications. There's that entire
Yeah.
field that or client base that you're serving.
Yeah, I'll give an example of a role, and I know that a lot of folks in the chat might not be programmers, or they're just getting into it. So apologies if this example is a little too esoteric. But in SF, there's a company called Twilio. It's a publicly traded company,
Ah,
and
Twilio.
yeah, what Twilio does is they provide a product where you can. They have an API, an applications programmable interface
Yes.
that lets you basically write code that hits their servers and send text messages, make phone calls, do anything that you might want to do normally with a telephone, but it lets you do it from a computer. And their entire company was built around this idea of let's allow any developer to send a text message from their code. So if we were doing a live coding session, I could pull up a text editor. I could write probably 10 lines of code that would transcribe what we're saying and send it as a text message to all of the people watching, which
Using the
might be
Twilio
annoying.
API.
Using the Twilio API, and I swear to God, I don't work for them, and I'm not like a
Oh,
shareholder.
no,
But
I actually do want to provide an example of using the Twitter API, which I have done myself.
yeah, sure.
Wherein, when you sign up for their developer portal and there's that
Mhm.
section where you label your device.
Yep.
As a joke, I labeled my device Hitachi Smart Fridge, and then I
Oh, nice.
ran the Python script using the Twitter API so that it made it look like I was tweeting from a smart fridge.
Beautiful. I love it.
But I wasn't really. It was just a lot like you said, from a text editor, you run that Python in your command line with the secrets pulled from the website,
Yep.
all that,
Yep.
and it'll just fire off in your your account,
Yep.
and
Yeah,
suddenly it's
totally.
saying you're tweeting from something that you're not really tweeting from.
Yeah, so all of these companies have these APIs, and in this case, it's a technical product. The end user is a programmer.
Hmm.
So Twilio, in this example, has a bunch of engineers that their job is to understand how their own company's product works, and then help developers make their stuff work. Because
Subject matter experts.
yeah, SMEs, exactly, subject matter experts, and there's a lot of different titles like solutions engineer,
Hmm.
support engineer, integration engineer, and they are often they don't have to necessarily be, but they are often more junior engineers getting into the role, have spent some time playing around with it, are able to send a tweet from a pretend to send a tweet from a or write 10 lines of code that sends a text message through an API, and they've done it over and over again. So when somebody says, hey, I tried to use the API and I couldn't figure it out, they can go, yeah, let me help you out. um, at my company at Branch, we actually had a program where we had constantly bringing in new junior engineers. We put them in this solution engineer or this integration engineer role where they were helping our customers. They became experts in our own product. They became more fluent with whatever programming language they were using. And then maybe after 6 months, maybe
Hmm.
after a year, we were saying, hey, we have a role open on our core engineering team. Are you interested in it? Some of them are, and some of them said, no, I really love working with customers every day. But that was kind of one of those gateway roles that I think is, worth considering.
Yeah, and this is tangentially related in terms of different roles people can do, or sorry, not roles, but rather ways people can get used to coding and looking at not necessarily production level code, but at least like
Yeah.
open source projects, looking on GitHub at public repos,
Yep.
repositories of code. I'm saying this for John's sake. You can look and see other people's code for like live extensions that are on the Chrome store and all kinds of projects and be like, how does this connect to that and how does that work? And like, whoa, there's an entire
Yeah.
world out there. Because I remember when I was right before I got that Silicon Valley job, I was looking at EFF's extensions and
Oh
working in
yeah.
JavaScript, being like, I hate JavaScript, but I want to help them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's
Totally.
one way to bolster your skills. Just see what other people are doing, and if you can ramp up and figure out what it all does, that's a very valuable skill to have.
Yeah, totally. Because again, that's going to be the same onboarding experience if and when you join a company. They're going to, here's our code, go figure it out. No, hopefully there's a better onboarding than that. But going back to your question, other roles, I'll rattle off a few more. But um, there's the whole domain of big data engineering,
Hmm.
data platform, data infrastructure, and this is the whole discipline of writing code solely with the purpose of managing and manipulating huge sets of data.
Hmm.
We're in a world where we have just millions and millions of data points nowadays. So we've had to carve out an entire new subset of our industry designed specifically for how do you deal with all of this data. And data engineering is the general blanket term for that type of engineer.
I see.
Yeah.
Oh, this is the distinction between data scientist and then data engineer.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, there's going to be a handful, tons of different engineer types that I don't even have exposure to because of the domain that I happen to be in.
Engine programmers.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Ooh, can you imagine writing your own engine?
Well, even like in the video game industry, there's probably like 10 plus roles that I just have no visibility into. And
I should I
I
should
don't
talk
know
to you
anything
later
about
about that because I reached out to a consultant and spoke to him. He used to work at Blizzard and Riot. And
that.
so the whole thing was like these are the different roles there are, like sound engineers,
Yeah.
special effects engineers, particle
Yeah.
engineers, all of that fun stuff.
Yeah. No, it's cooler titles than perhaps the ones I have. But
No, 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 that's not what I'm saying. It's just there's a lot out there.
yeah. But again, a lot of these specializations are not things that you need to really worry about. They can help directionally give you ideas of what's off in the horizon, but by no means is it something that you need to feel worried about focusing on and like, oh, I'm going to be a data scientist tomorrow. It's like, well, that could be a direction that you take. Why don't you learn more about what that looks like? And the reality is, most entry level roles are like, we're hiring a junior software engineer or we're hiring a level one software engineer, and they need to know basic JavaScript and we'll teach
Hmm.
you everything else on the way. It's like, great. don't worry about what hat you're wearing because you're probably going to have to wear a bunch of different hats along the way.
Mm-hmm.
And throughout your career, you can specialize, or you could. I know people that jump around from those different roles because they just love the challenge. Yeah,
Yeah, and there's also, if you find that, this is what I did because I found that development was too, it was difficult for me to come up with like a project and then build things upon that. So
yeah,
that's why I moved into QA because then my entire purpose is to just break things.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, even in QA, there's a lot of different facets of that because there's QA engineers, there's like manual test engineers,
Right.
there's automation engineers.
And there's a what's like SDET, software developer in test or something like that?
Yeah, that's like a role that I think Microsoft originally popularized.
Right.
If you're an SDET or an automation engineer, you're writing code every day. You might be
I
writing
think that's
automation.
more about like tooling the test suites,
Totally.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But like a lot of companies have very complex test suites,
Oh yeah.
and you're gonna be building and extending them and making them better and altering them to fit whatever use case you might have. So it's just like any way that you can
Hmm.
get code to help the company, like
See,
you're an engineer.
I regret that during my demo night, I didn't go into how I literally by myself looked at the Selenium docs and got a WebDriver up and running when everybody else was all like, oh, look at these pretty effects, and like front end, all that. I was busy working with a freaking WebDriver, doing tests, coverage.
Oh man, I've spent many, many hours wrestling with WebDriver, so I understand and I hear you. I would have felt your pain and I would have
It
appreciated that.
wasn't even that bad. I got it working and running. It's just that what I did for the screencast didn't
Yeah,
highlight the fact that I put so much emphasis into the testing
the
of
testing
my
side.
project.
Yeah,
So now I know I can talk about that. It's
yeah, totally.
valuable. But anyways, I forget how long did you say you wanted to be on for?
I'm pretty good. I know that you have oh, actually, I mean, how long do you normally stream for? I'm good to chat for another like 20 minutes, half an hour if you are as well.
I like to give guest speakers an hour 30. I don't want to overextend that. So if you
Cool.
want to keep going till 5:30, we can do that.
That sounds perfect.
Okay.
Yeah,
Let me take a look at chat. There were like a number of questions I just kind of glazed right over because it
sure.
didn't make sense to pivot into that yet. Let's see here. Where was it? Ah, yes, this is the big one. So, Quantum Brand is asking, this might be out of the scope of the discussion, but
Sure.
what do you think are effective ways that companies can address hiring inequalities regarding both women and people of color?
What are some of the effective ways?
Effective ways.
Yeah, so I've worked with in several companies different initiatives that have um, focused on this. I've worked through, proposed, and kind of collaborated on initiatives that have succeeded and ones that have failed.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to draw from experience here and not just talk out of my ass. And it would be great if companies did this and that'll solve all your problems because it won't. Um, so the effective ways, I would say, and I'm going to try to give a very pragmatic answer that's not too cynical because it's a really, really tough challenge.
Hmm.
Um, Firstly, I think that a company needs serious buy-in at the most senior level possible. And what I mean by that is having founders and executives that have a very genuine desire to invest in this particular initiative, whatever those initiatives might be. So I'm
Hmm.
starting at the very top. And the reason I say that is to be effective in actually like taking a tiny chunk out of this giant challenge that we're talking about, it's going to take years. Um, and if you don't have a company that has real legitimate buy-in at the top, every quarter a new roadmap item comes up. Every year there's a new priority and focus. And it's in those reprioritization meetings, it's in those, okay, it's 2021, we're still in COVID. What projects and initiatives aren't we going to fund this year? If you don't have
Ooh.
somebody at the very top that's bought in, then these types of initiatives and investments on behalf of companies can can fall by the wayside very easily. If you're lucky, you're at a company that has that buy-in. Um, but that is, in my opinion, table stakes. And it's not just an exec paying lip service to like, oh, we want to focus on, diversity and inclusion, and like we'll send out a newsletter every quarter, and like that's it. That's not going to do anything. And again, I'm talking about something very high level,
Hmm.
like before getting into like, oh, go to these recruiting events. They're really awesome because like those are good things to do too. But it would be such a shame if it all falls apart at the end of the quarter.
Right, because it is very much a cultural problem, not just, at the more granular level, what can you do?
Yeah. So unfortunately, that first thing that I said is not something anybody can easily be like, great, I'll just send an email to the CEO and be like, "Go
Right?
for it." But I think it is a signal when you're looking at different companies that you could look for to see how much are they talking about it, who's talking about it, and how consistently are they talking about these investments over time period. And that time period might be in the order of years.
Hmm.
And the reason why I say years is I know from experience this is how long making and seeing the first iota of results could take. So, for instance, let's say you had a company that said we are going to start going to let's say university colleges that typically have students from underrepresented groups in the tech industry. We're going to prioritize only going and sending our recruiters there. Great. I think that's actually a good idea because, to be honest, and I talked about this earlier, like the CS program in many of these great schools are all teaching similar curriculums, and a lot of the stuff that a new grad needs for success in a role isn't taught in school anyways. So
Hmm.
like the idea of only going to Harvard and like MIT, I think is ridiculous.
Right.
um, so that's the start. That's an idea. I could say, oh well, I would recommend that you send your recruiters to some of these schools. Um, so let's suppose that we did that on like January 1st. We made that decision. Well, the career fair might be on like, again, in a non-COVID world, the career fair might be in February. So you send your recruiters there, and you might actually do interviews in March.
Hmm.
You might do second round interviews end of March. You might
Hmm.
give offers in April for their next year's graduation,
Hmm.
or their next year's internship.
Hmm.
So you might be interviewing somebody in March of 2021 for a role that won't be filled until June of 2022, because that's just how universities work. You
Hmm.
interview in your third or fourth year, and the idea is that provided you graduate, you have a job waiting for you. So we're talking about potentially a year and a half from the day we decided, hey, we're going to do this initiative, to actually seeing any results. And every month, every quarter along the way, you're going to have you are, I'm saying you in that like the company, you're going to have situations where people are going to be like, how come the numbers haven't moved yet? How come the percentage of women on our Eng team haven't moved yet? Or how come the number of folks from underrepresented groups, you budgeted this big thing in January and it's June. How come we haven't seen anything yet? It's because it takes time. It can
Hmm.
take multiple years to see that impact. So that's why I was saying you need both. You need an understanding and a genuinely invested leadership team that
Hmm.
know it's going to take multiple years before you even make an iota of improvement, but that improvement is absolutely necessary. But you also need a bunch of these initiatives on the ground that are saying, we're going to plant these seeds today
Hmm.
so that in this one example I gave, so that we see the results in maybe a year and a half from now.
And that's not even getting into the retention rates of these people getting into the company.
Yeah, yeah. So
Like, are they
I
properly
made the
supported,
classic.
right?
I made the classic mistake of jumping straight to the recruiting example because if you have a really toxic culture in your company that is not inviting, and it is not like very inclusive to folks that are from certain groups that are underrepresented, like they're not going to stay. You're going to wait and a half. They're going to show up, and then a month later, they're going to be like, "Screw this! I'm going to go somewhere else." And that has to happen in parallel. It has to happen before you
Hmm.
make these moves. But we don't have time, so you have to do it. You basically have to do it all.
Yeah.
But yeah, to just echo what your comment was, like you need. I mean, and that's why a lot of companies call it a D&I initiative, diversity and inclusion. You're
Hmm.
simultaneously investing in ensuring that you have a more diverse workforce,
Hmm.
however you want to interpret that kind of. And also, it needs to be an inclusive workforce so that you're not hiring people and when they show up, you say, all right, now you're one of us, all same, wear this hoodie and listen to this music
Here's
and
your
do
company swag.
here's your company flag. You have to have an environment where it's like you bring something unique, maybe different than what we have today, but very welcomed
Hmm.
in this company. And if you can't do that, then you're not even going to get close to hitting that 1.7 average tenure rate. You're going to probably get like 3 months at the best.
Yikes.
Um, yeah, but yeah, that's definitely a topic that takes more than 10 minutes to go through. So I don't want to minimize it, but
Definitely.
yeah, it's tough. It's very tough.
I regret that that came in at the end. It's just that it was asked at the very beginning, and then
Hmm.
the topic was supposed to be what tracks can you take
Yep.
working in computer science, and it's just all over the place. But that's okay. We can always have a follow-up discussion, I think, if you are
Yeah,
willing,
totally.
of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, we have about, I want to say, 10 more minutes. Is there anything you want to emphasize about your channel since we are promoting it? I know it's been
Oh,
a while since you've streamed.
I'm not a huge streamer, and my stream is has nothing to do with tech.
I know it doesn't. That's why I'm asking you to explain it.
Sure, yeah. So I have a channel. I don't know how you shared it or what that even looks like. I'm like a total like Twitch noob.
Oh,
Like
I
always
have a automated bot that will spit it out the link on a timer.
cool.
Yeah, so they know about it.
Right, yeah. I mean, don't feel obligated to check it out, but if you're curious, my Twitch channel, I've live streamed playing poker. So I'm like outside of tech, one of my big passions and hobbies is playing a lot of poker. I've been playing the game for 15 years or so. And especially during COVID, a lot of the games moved online.
Of course.
And uh, a lot of my friends liked to learn, and I love sharing knowledge about the tech industry, but also some of my hobbies. And so I would play real online live poker, and I would stream my thought process, and I would also stream statistics because I take a very like shockingly very engineering and mathematical approach to the game. Um, and I played different variants of poker, and it's been a very that was like how I really got exposed to Twitch. I know a lot of folks followed gamers that stream, but for me, it was there's a pretty big like poker niche community, and
Hmm.
like got inspired by that and
I
tried it
see.
out. Yeah, unfortunately, because of the nature of the game, I usually have to stream with a 5 minute delay
That makes
because
sense.
the people I'm playing are probably watching the stream as well. And if they were seeing what I was doing in real time, it would be very difficult
Yeah.
to to win. Although I guess in games that's the same case. Most people stream with a delay when they're playing an actually semi-competitive game at the time.
Hmm.
Yeah, so if you're interested in checking that out, you're welcome to tune in.
I do have a question about what you mentioned regarding the variance of poker. I think that's perhaps the most accessible topic to ask clarification about. Like, what do
Sure.
you mean by different variants? Because I've heard of like Texas Hold'em, things like
Yep.
that. Like, what kind of variants are there? What's your favorite?
Yeah, so it's funny you ask. I'd say like most people have heard about Texas Hold'em. It's the one that's popular. It's the one that's on TV.
Hmm.
And I would say like 80% of the poker community, it's just like the gaming community. There are so many different games, so many different variants that people are playing, all with a regular deck of cards. But I don't even know what the equivalent in the gaming world would be of what's like the standard. I'm not going to say vanilla, but like what's the standard one or two games that like just everybody's streaming and playing right now? Like that's the Texas Hold'em. It's great. There's a huge following, but it's the other 20% or even 10% that I find really interesting. And then for me in particular, it's like the 1%, like the really weird niche games that no one really talks about, but like you can really geek out in, and it's a really small community, are the ones that I like and I will
Hmm.
often stream. So the different variants just have different rules. Sometimes you'll get more cards. Sometimes the rules have changed a little bit. Um, the game that I like the most, and it's a mouthful. So it's a game called Open Face Chinese. pineapple with Fantasyland,
What?
progressive. So that is the name of the game. Oh, open face Chinese, pineapple, Fantasyland, progressive. It's like the absurd name. There's probably
It
less than,
sounds like a clip URL, like an
yeah,
auto-generated
yeah,
clip
yeah.
URL.
Exactly. Yeah. Just string a bunch of words together. And I've streamed that a handful of times. I'm currently writing a book on it, which
Oh,
is I'm
wow.
hoping to publish this year. And I'm guessing there's probably less than maybe like 10,000 people in the entire world that even know how to play it, and then probably less than 5,000 people actively playing the game. So
So you're basically talking about what's essentially a dead language.
kind of,
Kind
yeah,
of, right? Because of
yeah, yeah, yeah.
the just the sample size.
It's so small, yeah, but it's super fun, and it's like part of me, I guess, likes it because it's not the mainstream.
Oh, that's
So
me about games too.
you know what I mean. But it's also like a really fun game, and yeah, that's my weird niche when I'm not doing the whole Silicon Valley tech thing.
I never expected it to have that esoteric of a name.
Yeah, I mean, and to be fair, I've applied my tech experience to this as well because, like, in studying the game, I wrote like a computer bot. I wrote a simulator. I wrote something that would play the game for me and help me understand it mathematically more, which is like the
Hmm.
nerdiest sentence I've ever said in a long time. But that's what I did. And
Now, how do we transfer that into game development?
yeah, well, let me see.
Oh, now we could make a game jam about your variant and just put that out there on like itch.io or whatever it's called.
Well, it's funny because it's like this particular variant of the game that I like, it's really accessible in that it's very different than standard poker. It's really basically just a card game. And like, like other card games, I've seen like Hearthstone streams on Twitch and other people streaming different games. When I mentioned that I wrote a bot, I'm sure people have written bots for some of the card games that are quite popular right now and figure out how to solve the game, how to play the game perfectly.
Hmm.
There's a lot of actually chess has recently blown up
Right.
in the Twitch
Yeah.
community. And there's a couple really famous chess grandmasters that are streaming all the time and they're hilarious. And there's a lot of debate in a lot of different games like chess about where's the place of AI and where's the future of this game when you're in a world where a computer can play it perfectly and a human is no longer able to compete.
Hmm.
And I find that on its own a very interesting topic
Hmm.
because it really starts to challenge what does competitive gaming look like in a world where the best competitor might be a bot. Um, it's really challenging the poker community right now, and I can imagine it is if it hasn't already challenging the gaming, like the esports and the competitive gaming
Hmm.
industry as well.
This is just me thinking 5 steps ahead. I
Yeah,
am going to bring on a game designer, an independent game designer who has a focus on both board games and card games.
love it.
So if you want to connect up at any
Sure.
point, I'll let
Yeah.
him know. I'll let him know. It'll be fun. But what more do you want to say about poker, about your other hobbies, about all those things? Because we've just been going on and on about computer science, but we want to know about Ian the person.
Yeah. Um, I don't know about the stream specifically. I don't think much more. If you want to check
That's
it out in
fine.
live, you can check it out. I think it's been very important for me to balance my hobbies and my career.
Yeah,
Um, but it's interesting because like I got into coding. I got into the industry because coding was my hobby.
right.
Um, so perhaps in a somewhat unconventional way, by the time I got to high school and college, I already knew most of the coding stuff,
Hmm.
and because of my hobby, and it wasn't because I wanted a job in tech. It's because like I wanted to figure out how to program stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but then I did realize though, once I got into the industry and I was coding every day, all day at work, then finding other hobbies was a very important not just outlet, but balance for me in
Hmm.
life. Sadly though, like I used to be a huge gamer. Uh, And I gamed because I wanted to. Well, I mean, I loved it, but I also wanted to get into the gaming industry. I wanted to work on a big title. And when I finally attained the skills and the experience and the clout to potentially do that, like I don't play many games anymore. It's like all my friends are always just like I'm in a Discord server with a bunch of my friends, and all like they're always in a group chat and they're always playing like Apex or something, and I'm just like just sitting in the corner, like
I
you
gotta
know,
tell you about Supergiant then. Hades, just play Hades.
all
Play
right,
Pyre. Play one of their titles. Because those are solo experiences. You don't need people to play those with. They have multiplayer components for Pyre, but
yeah,
try one of them. It's more soothing than being like, oh no, what is it, like 100 people against you? No, no, no.
yeah. Oh gosh, it sounds stressful.
Exactly. That's why I'm just like, just play Pyre. It'll be soothing and it'll be all for you. It's your personalized experience with the story and the characters. And
Nice, yeah.
I'm
No,
not
that sounds.
sponsored by them. I wish I
Sure,
was,
yeah,
but I'm
yeah.
not
I like
sponsored by them.
the logo comes up on the bottom of the screen.
I actually
Uh,
have this little guy right here if you see him in the corner. So that, oh, you're not looking at it though, but everybody else can see it. So there we go.
oh yeah, there he is. Okay, that's funny.
Yeah. Um,
Um, but yeah, no, maybe maybe I'll slowly get back into gaming. Maybe not. We'll see.
if ever you need recommendations, I know a lot simply because I know how to look into the gaming news. I know about how to access indie titles. I
Yeah,
did a research paper on video games,
nice.
so all of that.
I actually get like option paralysis when I think about how many games there are. Because like,
Right, which is why I tell people, tell me what you like about games in terms of mechanics, story, all of that, and I will give you a recommendation suited to your tastes.
ooh, great, yeah.
I'm
Because
better
all the
than the Steam
recommendations,
algorithm.
yeah, the recommendations my friends are giving me, I'm like, that does not sound like something I want to do.
I know how to
Um,
shill a game, trust me.
oh wow, nice. Hmm, okay.
But anyways,
You're the hand curated recommendation algorithm. I like that.
I mean, I convinced maybe like a dozen people to play Hades when I was still doing it early access. Like before it even hit
Mm,
Steam, people were like,
yeah.
I need to play this game. So, Anyways, I don't want to keep you over time. It was a pleasure to have you on the channel, Ian, and I hope everybody goes to at least check out your content or like hits you up on Twitter and all of that. So,
Right. Yeah, it was a pleasure to be here, and thanks for having me.
of course. All right, then, take care. I'm gonna figure out if everybody wants to raid someone, but for now, I will
Cool.
talk to you another time. Take
Cheers.
care. Bye. All right, everybody, I need to close out of Zoom, and we need to figure out where we are going. Let me take a look at the dashboard real fast. Where is my dashboard? Did I open that? Did I lose that? Uh-oh. Cool show. Thanks for all the insights. Yeah, I know. That was fun, wasn't it? Let me take a look, see. Do not feel obligated to hop on in. How do you feel about watching Fall Guys? I know that's been a big game for a lot of people. I'm just looking at who's live that I follow right now, or we can check out something else. Do we have any interest in Fall Guys? There's also someone playing Majin Tensei 2, which is a Shin Megami Tensei spin-off title. There's art. There is, of course, Sean Chiplock playing Fallen Legion Revenants. And then Joe Zija is still. You know what? Let's do Joe, because I know he doesn't necessarily need the numbers, but it's just the show of goodwill, considering he has rated me in the past. I do believe that we need to raid Joe back. Let me take a look here. Raid every last one of them. Let's make that the raid cheer. So copy that. Everybody got that ready? We're going to paste that in Joe's chat. On three, two, one, go. Oh my goodness. All right.